The morning air in Sarajevo carried the acrid smell of burning buildings and the distant echo of gunfire. Captain Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a concrete barrier, her radio crackling with urgent voices from various units scattered across the war-torn city. As a communications specialist with the United Nations peacekeeping forces, she had seen her share of conflicts, but nothing had prepared her for the brutal reality of the Bosnian War in 1993. Sarah's weathered hands gripped the radio transmitter as she coordinated evacuation routes for civilians trapped in the besieged neighborhoods. At 32, she had already served in 3 different conflict zones, earning respect from both her superiors and subordinates for her tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to protecting innocent lives. Her olive-green uniform bore the patches of multiple humanitarian missions, each representing months of danger and sacrifice in the world's most volatile regions. The peacekeeping base was a converted school building, its windows boarded up with steel plates and sandbags stacked around the perimeter. Inside, the hallways that once echoed with children's laughter now buzzed with military communications and strategic planning sessions. Sarah worked closely with Commander James Richardson, a veteran officer whose calm demeanor and sharp tactical mind had saved countless lives during their joint missions. Richardson was more than just Sarah's commanding officer. He had become a trusted mentor and friend over their 2 years of working together. His ability to see beyond the immediate chaos and develop long-term strategies for conflict resolution had earned him recognition from UN headquarters. Sarah often found herself learning from his approach to complex situations, watching how he balanced military necessity with humanitarian concerns. The current mission involved establishing safe corridors for civilian evacuations while maintaining neutrality between the warring factions. Bosnian Serb forces had surrounded several neighborhoods where ethnic minorities were trapped without food, medical supplies, or clean water. The situation grew more desperate each day as winter approached, and basic necessities became increasingly scarce. Sarah's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from one of the forward observation posts. The voice was tense, filled with barely controlled panic. Base Command, this is Outpost 7. We have a situation developing at the checkpoint near the Old Market. Large convoy of armed vehicles moving towards civilian areas. Requesting immediate instructions. She quickly patched the call through to Richardson's office, while simultaneously pulling up detailed maps of the area on her computer terminal. The market district had been a focal point of tension for weeks, with reports of forced relocations and harassment of minority families. Sarah knew that any military movement in that direction could spell disaster for the hundreds of families still living in the area. Richardson emerged from his office, his face grim as he studied the incoming intelligence reports. Sarah, I need you to coordinate with our liaison contacts on both sides. We need to understand what's happening and why there's sudden movement toward the civilian areas. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked frantically to piece together information from various sources. Her contacts within the local community reported seeing unusual military preparations in the hills surrounding the city. Families were being warned by neighbors to prepare for possible evacuation, but many had nowhere to go and insufficient resources to leave their homes. The intelligence picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Intercepted communications suggested that paramilitary groups were planning a major operation aimed at clearing the remaining minority populations from several key neighborhoods. The operation appeared to be coordinated with regular military units, indicating a level of planning and resources that went beyond typical harassment campaigns. Sarah brought her findings to Richardson, who immediately called an emergency meeting with the senior peacekeeping staff. The small conference room filled with officers from different countries, each bringing their own perspective on how to respond to the developing crisis. The debate was intense, with some arguing for immediate military intervention while others insisted on maintaining strict neutrality. Richardson listened carefully to all viewpoints before outlining his assessment of the situation. We have credible intelligence indicating an imminent threat to civilian populations. Our mandate allows for protective action when innocent lives are at stake. I'm proposing a show of force combined with diplomatic pressure to deter any large-scale operation against civilians. The plan that emerged involved positioning peacekeeping vehicles at key intersections to create visible barriers between military forces and civilian areas. Simultaneously, Richardson would personally meet with commanders from all sides to negotiate a cooling-off period that would allow for proper evacuation procedures if military action became unavoidable. Sarah coordinated the logistics of the operation, ensuring that each unit understood their role and the rules of engagement. The peacekeepers would maintain defensive positions only, intervening directly only if civilians came under immediate attack. It was a delicate balance that required split-second decision-making and perfect coordination between multiple units spread across the city. As evening approached, reports began filtering in of military vehicles massing in the hills above the city. Sarah's contacts reported seeing artillery pieces being positioned and supplies being moved forward, suggesting that whatever operation was planned would begin soon. The atmosphere at the peacekeeping base grew increasingly tense as everyone prepared for what could become a major humanitarian crisis. Richardson decided to establish a forward command post closer to the threatened areas, allowing for better communication with both military commanders and civilian leaders. Sarah volunteered to accompany him, knowing that her communication skills and local contacts would be essential if negotiations became necessary. The forward post was set up in an abandoned office building that provided good visibility over the surrounding neighborhoods. Sarah established communication links with the main base, while Richardson met with a delegation of local community leaders who were desperate for protection. The faces of these men and women showed the strain of months under siege, but also a determination to protect their families and community. As night fell, Sarah monitored radio chatter from various military units positioned around the city. The conversations she intercepted revealed growing tension and preparation for some kind of major operation. Equipment was being moved under cover of darkness, and units were receiving ammunition and supplies typically associated with prolonged combat operations. Around midnight, Sarah's radio erupted with urgent traffic from multiple sources. Military convoys were moving toward predetermined positions, and advanced reconnaissance teams had been spotted near civilian areas. The operation that intelligence had warned about appeared to be beginning earlier than expected, catching the peacekeeping forces partially unprepared. Richardson immediately ordered all peacekeeping units to their designated positions while he attempted to contact military commanders on both sides. Sarah worked frantically to coordinate communications between scattered units while simultaneously trying to reach her civilian contacts to warn them of the developing situation. The next several hours passed in a blur of urgent radio transmissions, hasty strategic adjustments, and growing anxiety about the safety of civilian populations. Sarah found herself at the center of a complex web of communications, relaying information between military units, civilian leaders, and UN headquarters while helping Richardson coordinate the peacekeeping response. As dawn approached, the situation took a dramatic and unexpected turn. Richardson had arranged to meet with the local military commander at a neutral location to discuss the developing crisis. The meeting was supposed to take place at an abandoned church halfway between the peacekeeping post and the military positions in the hills. Sarah watched through binoculars as Richardson's convoy departed for the meeting location. She maintained radio contact as the vehicles made their way through the empty streets, past checkpoints manned by nervous soldiers, toward what everyone hoped would be a successful diplomatic intervention. The radio went silent at 0647 hours. Sarah tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, her calls becoming increasingly urgent as minutes passed without response. Other peacekeeping units reported losing visual contact with Richardson's convoy as it disappeared into a valley near the meeting location. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by distant gunfire and the rumble of heavy vehicles moving through the city. When contact was finally re-established an hour later, the news was devastating. Richardson's convoy had been ambushed, and the commander himself had been taken hostage by paramilitary forces. The attack appeared to have been carefully planned, timed to remove the senior peacekeeping officer just as the major military operation was beginning. Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief as the reports continued to pour in. Richardson was alive, but being held at an unknown location somewhere in the hills above the city. His captors were demanding the withdrawal of all peacekeeping forces from the area as a condition for his release. Meanwhile, the military operation against civilian areas was proceeding as planned, with no one in position to negotiate a halt to the violence. The peacekeeping force suddenly found itself without its most experienced leader at the moment when leadership was most critical. Sarah realized that with Richardson gone, she was the most knowledgeable person regarding the local situation and the complex relationships between different factions. The responsibility for coordinating the peacekeeping response was falling to officers who lacked detailed knowledge of the area and the players involved. Reports began coming in of artillery strikes against civilian areas and paramilitary units entering neighborhoods where minority families lived. The careful diplomatic balance that Richardson had maintained was collapsing, and innocent people were paying the price. Sarah knew that without immediate action, the situation would deteriorate into exactly the kind of humanitarian catastrophe that the peacekeeping mission was designed to prevent. As she listened to increasingly desperate calls for help from civilian areas, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. The official peacekeeping response was paralyzed by Richardson's capture and the lack of clear leadership. Diplomatic channels had failed, and military intervention by the peacekeeping force seemed impossible given their limited mandate and resources. But Sarah had spent months building relationships with people on all sides of the conflict. She knew the terrain, understood the motivations of different groups, and had contacts that other peacekeepers lacked. Most importantly, she knew that Richardson would want her to do whatever was necessary to protect innocent lives, regardless of the personal risk involved. The communication equipment around her buzzed with urgent traffic as the crisis deepened. Sarah looked out at the city where smoke was beginning to rise from several neighborhoods. Somewhere in those hills, Richardson was being held captive by people who had already shown their willingness to target peacekeepers. The official response was failing, diplomatic options were exhausted, and time was running out for the civilians who depended on international protection. Sarah began to formulate a plan that was as dangerous as it was necessary. Sarah stared at the tactical maps spread across the table, her mind racing through possibilities and calculating risks. The morning sun cast long shadows through the broken windows of the forward command post as reports continued to arrive of escalating violence in the civilian areas. Each radio transmission brought news of families under fire, medical facilities targeted, and escape routes being systematically blocked. The temporary command structure that had emerged after Richardson's capture was struggling to maintain coordination. Officers from different countries debated response options, while precious time slipped away. Sarah listened to their discussions with growing frustration, knowing that diplomatic protocols and chain-of-command procedures were preventing any meaningful action while people died in the neighborhoods below. Her radio operator, a young soldier named Martinez, approached with the latest intelligence summary. "Captain, we've confirmed the locations of 3 major artillery positions in the hills. They're targeting the old quarter where most of the minority families live. Civilian casualties are mounting, and we're receiving reports of door-to-door searches in several buildings." Sarah studied the intelligence reports, cross-referencing them with her own knowledge of the area's geography and the network of contacts she had built over months of peacekeeping work. A plan was forming in her mind, one that would require her to operate completely outside official channels and accept personal responsibility for whatever consequences might follow. The key to success lay in her relationship with Miriam Kovac, a local woman who ran an underground network helping families escape from dangerous areas. Miriam had lost her husband and 2 sons in an earlier attack, but instead of fleeing the city, she had chosen to stay and help others. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had worked secretly with Miriam to arrange safe passage for dozens of families, providing intelligence and coordination that made the difference between life and death. Sarah excused herself from the command post, ostensibly to check communication equipment in another building. Instead, she made her way to a pre-arranged meeting location where Miriam would be waiting with the latest information about conditions in the affected neighborhoods. The meeting point was a basement room beneath a partially destroyed bakery, accessed through a hidden entrance that had been used by resistance fighters in previous conflicts. Miriam was already there when Sarah arrived, her face showing the strain of coordinating multiple rescue operations simultaneously. Despite the danger, she had been moving through the city all morning, gathering intelligence about which buildings were under attack and which families still needed evacuation. Her network of volunteers included teachers, shop owners, and even some police officers who had chosen to help their neighbors rather than participate in the ethnic cleansing campaign. The situation is worse than your reports indicate, Miriam said immediately. They're not just trying to force people to leave. This is systematic elimination. I've seen execution sites where families were taken after being removed from their homes. The paramilitary groups are following lists of names and addresses. They know exactly who they're looking for. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she absorbed this information. The peacekeeping force had assumed they were dealing with forced relocation, brutal, but ultimately aimed at moving people rather than killing them. If Miriam was correct, then hundreds of innocent people were facing immediate execution rather than displacement. How many families are still trapped in the targeted areas? Sarah asked, already knowing that the official evacuation procedures would be too slow to save lives at the rate the violence was escalating. At least 300 families in the old quarter alone, Miriam replied. Maybe more in the areas near the river where the attacks started during the night. My people are trying to get accurate counts, but it's becoming too dangerous to move around. The paramilitary units are shooting anyone they see on the streets, and they've positioned snipers to control the main escape routes. Sarah spread her tactical map on a crate that served as a table, marking the locations that Miriam described. The pattern that emerged was chillingly systematic. The attackers had clearly studied the neighborhood layout and population distribution, designing their operation to trap residents while preventing escape or rescue attempts. What about Commander Richardson? Sarah asked. Have you heard anything about where he's being held? Miriam nodded grimly. My sources say he's being kept at an old monastery about 15 kilometers north of the city. It's a place the paramilitary groups have been using as a headquarters for several weeks. The location is heavily defended, and they're using him as insurance against any attempt by the peacekeeping forces to interfere with their operation. Sarah studied the map, tracing potential routes between the monastery and the city. Richardson's location was strategically chosen to be easily defendable while remaining close enough to the main operation that his captors could monitor peacekeeping responses. Any rescue attempt would require significant resources and would likely result in his death before the rescuers could reach him. I need to ask something of you that's extremely dangerous, Sarah said, looking directly at Miriam. I'm going to attempt to reach the monastery and negotiate Richardson's release. While I'm doing that, I need your network to coordinate evacuation efforts in the city. Can your people handle that level of organization? Miriam was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of what Sarah was proposing. My network can handle the evacuations if we have accurate intelligence about safe routes and timing. But you're talking about going alone into territory controlled by people who have already shown they're willing to kill peacekeepers. Even if you reach the monastery, what makes you think they'll negotiate? Sarah had been thinking about this question since she first learned of Richardson's capture. I have something they want more than they want Richardson dead. Information about peacekeeping troop positions and response plans. They need to know what kind of opposition they might face if they expand their operation beyond the current targets. It was a dangerous gamble that relied on the assumption that Richardson's captors were rational actors who could be reasoned with rather than fanatics committed to violence regardless of consequences. Sarah knew there was a significant chance that approaching them would simply result in 2 hostages instead of 1. But the alternative was watching hundreds of innocent people die while the official response remained paralyzed. There's something else, Miriam said. One of my contacts works at the monastery. A woman named Elena, who cooks for the paramilitary group. She's been sending information about their activities, and she might be able to help if you can reach the location safely. Sarah felt a spark of hope at this news. Having an ally already inside the target location could make the difference between success and failure. How do I contact Elena? And how do I know she can be trusted? Elena lost her daughter in one of the early attacks, Miriam explained. She's working with the paramilitary group because they threatened her remaining family members, but she's been secretly helping families escape when she can. She knows you by reputation from the families you've helped evacuate. The plan that emerged from their discussion was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and coordination between multiple groups operating independently. Sarah would approach the monastery alone, using back roads and traveling at night to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Miriam's network would begin systematic evacuations from the threatened neighborhoods, using intelligence about paramilitary positions to identify safe routes and timing. Sarah returned to the forward command post to gather the equipment she would need for the mission. She selected lightweight communication gear that would allow her to maintain contact with both the peacekeeping base and Miriam's network. She also assembled medical supplies and emergency food, knowing that the journey to the monastery could take much longer than planned if she encountered unexpected obstacles. The most critical decision involved what information she would be willing to trade for Richardson's release. Sarah had access to detailed intelligence about peacekeeping force positions, response plans, and communication procedures. Revealing some of this information could compromise the safety of her fellow peacekeepers, but holding back too much might make the negotiation impossible. As evening approached, Sarah prepared to leave the relative safety of the forward command post and venture into territory controlled by hostile forces. She left detailed instructions for Martinez about coordinating with Miriam's evacuation network, along with a sealed letter explaining her actions for delivery to UN headquarters if she failed to return. The journey to the monastery began just after midnight, with Sarah traveling on foot through abandoned neighborhoods and rural areas to avoid detection. She had studied satellite imagery of the route and memorized the locations of known checkpoints and patrol areas. Her olive green uniform was replaced with civilian clothing that would allow her to blend in if she encountered local residents. The first several hours passed without incident as Sarah made her way through empty streets and across fields where crops had been abandoned when their owners fled the fighting. The silence was periodically broken by distant gunfire and the rumble of heavy vehicles, reminders that the violent operation in the city was continuing while she moved toward what might be the key to stopping it. As dawn approached, Sarah reached the hills surrounding the monastery and began the careful process of observing the target location from concealed positions. The building itself was a medieval stone structure surrounded by newer concrete walls and defensive positions. She counted at least 20 armed guards and noted the positions of heavy weapons that could be used to repel any assault. Through her binoculars, Sarah observed the daily routine at the monastery, noting patrol schedules and identifying which areas offered the best concealment for approaching the perimeter. She also watched for any sign of Elena, the cook who might be able to provide assistance from inside the compound. The radio traffic she intercepted revealed that the paramilitary leadership was indeed using the monastery as a command center for the ongoing operation in the city. Orders were being transmitted to various units, and reports were coming in about the progress of the systematic attacks on civilian areas. Sarah realized that disrupting operations at the monastery could have immediate impact on the violence in the city, even if she failed to secure Richardson's release. As the day progressed, Sarah identified what appeared to be the best approach route to the monastery walls. A drainage canal provided concealment for most of the distance, while a gap in the defensive perimeter near the kitchen area offered a potential entry point. The timing would be critical, requiring her to move during a brief window when patrol schedules created a blind spot in the guards' coverage. The plan she finalized required her to approach the monastery during the evening meal preparation, when Elena would be working in the kitchen and might be able to facilitate entry without triggering an alarm. Sarah would then attempt to make contact with the paramilitary leadership, presenting herself as a representative of the peacekeeping forces authorized to negotiate Richardson's release. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah prepared for what could be either a diplomatic breakthrough or a suicide mission. She checked her communication equipment one final time and reviewed the intelligence she was prepared to trade. In a few hours, she would discover whether months of building relationships and understanding local dynamics could be leveraged into saving both Richardson and the hundreds of innocent people still trapped in the city below. The sun disappeared behind the hills as Sarah began her final approach to the monastery. She had spent the entire day observing patrol patterns and guard rotations, identifying a narrow window of opportunity when the kitchen area would be minimally supervised. Her heart pounded as she crawled through the drainage canal, the cold water soaking through her civilian clothing while she tried to remain completely silent. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The scrape of her boots against concrete, the splash of water displaced by her movement. Even her own breathing felt dangerously loud. Sarah paused frequently to listen for any sign that her presence had been detected, but heard only the distant conversations of guards and the mechanical sounds of vehicles moving around the compound. The drainage canal ended about 50 meters from the monastery's outer wall, leaving Sarah exposed as she covered the remaining distance to the perimeter fence. She waited until a patrol passed before sprinting across the open ground, her body low to minimize her profile against the starlit sky. The fence itself was topped with razor wire, but she had identified a section where earlier damage had created a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Sarah's hands shook as she carefully maneuvered through the gap, feeling the sharp metal tear at her jacket while she fought to avoid making any noise that might alert the guards. Once through the fence, she found herself in a small courtyard behind the kitchen building, exactly as the reconnaissance had suggested. Warm light spilled from the kitchen windows, and she could see figures moving inside as the evening meal was being prepared. Finding Elena proved easier than expected. The woman emerged from the kitchen carrying food scraps to a compost area, providing Sarah with an opportunity to make contact without approaching the main building. Sarah whispered Elena's name from the shadows, causing the older woman to freeze momentarily before slowly turning toward the sound. Elena's face showed a mixture of fear and recognition when she spotted Sarah crouched beside a storage shed. The two women had never met directly, but Miriam had described Sarah in detail during their planning sessions. Elena quickly glanced around to ensure they were unobserved before motioning for Sarah to follow her back toward the kitchen building. "You should not be here," Elena whispered urgently in accented English. "They have guards everywhere, and they are very nervous because of the fighting in the city. If they find you, they will kill you immediately." Sarah explained her mission in quick, quiet sentences, emphasizing the urgent need to negotiate Richardson's release before the situation in the city deteriorated further. Elena listened with growing alarm, clearly understanding the enormous risks involved in what Sarah was proposing. "The commander they captured is being held in the old chapel basement," Elena revealed. "There are always 2 guards posted there, and the leader comes to question him several times each day. The man in charge is called Markovich, and he is very dangerous. He believes the peacekeepers are protecting his enemies, and he wants revenge for what he says are attacks on his people." Sarah absorbed this information while formulating her approach strategy. Markovich's motivation suggested he might be willing to negotiate if presented with compelling reasons to believe that killing Richardson would work against his broader objectives. The challenge would be reaching him without being shot by nervous guards who had been conditioned to view any unidentified person as a threat. Elena agreed to help by creating a distraction that would allow Sarah to reach the main building undetected. During the evening shift change, Elena would deliberately cause a commotion in the kitchen area, drawing guards away from their normal positions long enough for Sarah to slip inside through a service entrance. The plan required Sarah to navigate through the monastery's interior corridors to reach Markovich's office, which Elena indicated was on the 2nd floor of the main building. The route would take her past several occupied rooms where paramilitary fighters were stationed, making detection almost inevitable if the timing wasn't perfect. Sarah waited in the shadows while Elena returned to the kitchen to prepare for the distraction. Through the windows, she could see the woman methodically arranging pots and dishes in positions that would create maximum noise when deliberately knocked over. The simplicity of the plan was both reassuring and terrifying. Everything depended on split-second timing and Elena's ability to sell the performance convincingly. The shift change began precisely at 9 o'clock, with guards moving between positions according to the schedule Sarah had observed throughout the day. Elena's distraction followed moments later, as the sound of crashing pots and her angry shouts in the local language drew multiple guards toward the kitchen area. Sarah moved quickly but carefully through the service entrance, finding herself in a narrow corridor that connected the kitchen to the main building. The monastery's medieval architecture created numerous alcoves and shadowed areas that provided concealment as she made her way toward the central staircase. The interior of the building revealed the extent to which it had been militarized. Communications equipment filled rooms that had once housed religious artifacts, and ammunition supplies were stored in chambers that had previously served as meditation spaces. Sarah could hear radio chatter from multiple locations, confirming that the monastery was indeed serving as the primary command center for operations throughout the region. Reaching the 2nd floor required passing directly in front of a guard post, But Elena's distraction was still causing confusion in other parts of the building. Sarah timed her movement to coincide with the guard's attention being focused on the commotion below, slipping past the checkpoint and into the corridor that led to Markovich's office. The sound of voices coming from behind a heavy wooden door indicated that she had found the right location. Sarah paused outside to listen, trying to determine how many people were inside and whether this was an appropriate time to attempt contact. She could distinguish at least 3 different voices speaking in a mixture of the local language and broken English. Sarah's training had covered negotiation techniques for hostage situations, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of voluntarily walking into a room full of armed extremists. She checked her communication equipment one final time, ensuring that her location was being transmitted to both the peacekeeping base and Miriam's network. If the negotiation failed, at least there would be a record of what she had attempted. She knocked on the door and waited for a response, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether her mission had any chance of success. The conversations inside stopped immediately, followed by the sound of weapons being readied and footsteps approaching the door. When the door opened, Sarah found herself face to face with a heavily armed guard who appeared stunned to see an unidentified woman in civilian clothing. Before he could react, Sarah identified herself clearly and loudly. "I am Captain Sarah Mitchell with the United Nations Peacekeeping Forces. I am here to speak with Markovich about the release of Commander Richardson." The guard shouted for his companions while keeping his weapon trained on Sarah. Within seconds, 3 more armed men had emerged from the office, all pointing guns at her while debating in rapid, angry voices about what to do with an unexpected visitor. Sarah kept her hands visible and continued to identify herself, emphasizing that she was there for diplomatic rather than military purposes. Markovich himself appeared after several tense minutes, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes that evaluated Sarah as if she were a tactical problem to be solved. He spoke briefly with his men before addressing Sarah directly in surprisingly good English. "Captain Mitchell," he said with a slight smile that contained no warmth. "We know who you are. You are the one who has been helping our enemies escape justice. Many of my people believe you should be treated as a combatant rather than a neutral peacekeeper." Sarah felt a chill at his words, but maintained her composure as she responded. "I'm here because the situation in the city is escalating beyond anyone's ability to control it. Commander Richardson's capture has eliminated the primary diplomatic channel that might have prevented a larger conflict. I believe we can find a solution that serves everyone's interests better than the current trajectory." Markovich gestured for her to enter his office while his guards remained positioned to prevent any escape attempt. The room was spartanly furnished but contained detailed maps of the region covered with tactical markings and target lists. Sarah noticed photographs on the walls showing what appeared to be sites of previous attacks, suggesting that the current operation was part of a larger, systematic campaign. "You speak of everyone's interests," Markovich said, settling into a chair behind a simple wooden desk. "But your peacekeeping forces serve the interests of those who have been killing my people for months. Why should I release your commander when you continue to protect the people responsible for these attacks?" Sarah had anticipated this line of reasoning and had prepared her response carefully. The peacekeeping mission serves the interest of preventing civilian casualties on all sides. Commander Richardson's work has saved lives from every ethnic group in this region. His continued detention serves no strategic purpose and prevents the kind of coordination that could actually reduce the violence you're concerned about. The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of motivations driving the paramilitary operation. Markovich described attacks on villages where his extended family lived, presenting photographs of destroyed homes and casualty lists that demonstrated genuine grievances underlying the current violence. His men had been recruited from communities that had suffered significant losses, creating a cycle of revenge that was proving difficult to break. Sarah listened carefully while formulating arguments that might appeal to Markovich's strategic thinking rather than his emotional commitment to revenge. She gradually steered the conversation toward the practical consequences of continuing the current operation, emphasizing how escalation would likely bring larger peacekeeping forces and international attention that would ultimately work against his group's objectives. "The operation in the city is creating exactly the kind of international incident that will justify a major military response," Sarah argued. Right now, you're dealing with a small peacekeeping force with limited mandate and resources. But systematic attacks on civilian populations will bring NATO forces with a much more aggressive approach to stopping the violence. Markovich's response suggested that he had considered this possibility, but believed his group could complete their objectives before any larger intervention could be organized. We have perhaps 48 hours before external forces can respond meaningfully. That is sufficient time to complete the necessary work in the targeted areas. The casual way he referred to necessary work confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the true nature of the operation. This wasn't forced relocation or intimidation tactics. It was systematic elimination of entire families and communities. The scope of the planned violence was far beyond what anyone at the peacekeeping base had imagined. Sarah shifted her negotiating strategy to focus on immediate rather than long-term consequences. You're right that external intervention will take time to organize, she acknowledged. But the current operation is creating coordination problems that are working against your objectives. Resistance is organizing, escape routes are being established, and target populations are receiving advance warning. The longer this continues, the lower your success rate becomes. This argument appeared to resonate more effectively with Markovich's tactical mindset. Sarah could see him considering the operational challenges his forces were encountering as organized opposition developed in response to their attacks. The conversations she had overheard while approaching his office had included reports of casualties among his own men and difficulties in locating target families who had already fled their homes. "What exactly are you proposing?" Markovich asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than mere curiosity. Sarah took a deep breath before presenting the offer she had been developing throughout their conversation. It was risky and morally complex, but it might be the only way to prevent a larger catastrophe while securing Richardson's release. Sarah looked directly into Markovich's eyes as she formulated her proposal. "I can provide you with detailed intelligence about peacekeeping force positions and response capabilities. More importantly, I can coordinate a temporary withdrawal from key areas that would allow you to complete your objectives without interference. In exchange, you release Commander Richardson and agree to avoid targeting certain protected locations where non-combatant families have taken shelter." The silence that followed her words was broken only by radio chatter from the adjoining rooms and the distant sound of vehicles moving through the compound. Markovich studied her carefully, clearly trying to determine whether she was offering genuine intelligence or attempting some kind of deception. His years of experience in irregular warfare had taught him to be suspicious of offers that seemed too advantageous. "You would betray your own forces to save one man?" he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would appeal to his understanding of tactical priorities. "I'm offering you information that you probably already possess through your own intelligence networks. The difference is that I can provide real-time updates and coordinate timing in ways that prevent unnecessary casualties on both sides." Richardson's release removes a diplomatic obstacle that's currently preventing any negotiated solution to this conflict. Markovich called for one of his subordinates and spoke rapidly in their local language. Sarah caught enough words to understand that they were discussing the current status of operations in the city and the challenges their forces were encountering. The conversation confirmed her assessment that the paramilitary operation was facing more resistance than originally anticipated. "The families you want to protect," Markovich said, turning back to Sarah. "How many people are we discussing, and where are they located?" Sarah pulled out a detailed map she had prepared before leaving the peacekeeping base, showing the locations where Miriam's network had established emergency shelters for displaced families. The sites had been chosen specifically to be defensible while remaining outside the main operational areas that paramilitary forces needed to control. "Approximately 800 people in 6 different locations," Sarah explained, pointing to each site on the map. "These are families with children, elderly relatives, and medical patients who cannot be easily relocated again. They pose no threat to your operations and have no strategic value." Markovich studied the map for several minutes, cross-referencing it with his own tactical charts and consulting with his advisors. Sarah could see him calculating whether protecting these specific locations would significantly interfere with his broader objectives. The key to the negotiation was demonstrating that she was offering him something valuable while asking for concessions that didn't compromise his core mission. What intelligence can you provide about peacekeeping response plans? Markovich asked. We know they are considering more aggressive action, but we need details about timing and force composition. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Providing accurate intelligence about peacekeeping operations could potentially result in the deaths of her colleagues if Markovich chose to attack their positions. However, withholding information would likely result in the negotiations' failure and the continuation of violence against civilian populations. Sarah made a calculated decision to reveal information that was likely already known through other sources while holding back details that could directly endanger peacekeeping personnel. The current peacekeeping mandate limits direct intervention unless there is immediate threat to international personnel. However, systematic attacks on civilian populations will trigger a more robust response within 24 to 48 hours. She provided additional details about communication procedures and coordination challenges between different national contingents within the peacekeeping force. This intelligence was tactically useful but didn't reveal specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited to attack peacekeeping positions. Markovich appeared satisfied with the information Sarah provided, but he had one additional demand that caught her completely off guard. To ensure your good faith in this arrangement, you will remain here as my guest until the current operation is completed. If you have been honest about peacekeeping intentions, there should be no interference with our activities. If there is interference, you will share Commander Richardson's fate. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her rescue mission had just turned into a hostage situation. Instead of securing Richardson's release, she had simply created a second bargaining chip for Markovich to use against the peacekeeping forces. The calculation she had made about trading intelligence for lives had backfired in the worst possible way. However, before she could respond to this development, urgent radio traffic from the communication center interrupted their conversation. One of Markovich's men rushed into the office with reports of unexpected activity in the city that was disrupting the planned operations. Sarah listened carefully to the reports, recognizing references to locations where Miriam's evacuation network was operating. The intelligence that emerged painted a picture of coordinated resistance that was preventing paramilitary forces from achieving their objectives according to the planned timeline. Families were disappearing from targeted buildings before assault teams arrived. Escape routes were being protected by armed civilians, and communications were being intercepted and jammed at crucial moments. Markovich's expression grew increasingly angry as he absorbed the reports from his field commanders. It appears that your evacuation activities have been more extensive than we realized, he said, turning back to Sarah with obvious suspicion. Perhaps this negotiation is simply another attempt to delay our operations while your allies organize resistance. Sarah realized that Miriam's network had been even more effective than either of them had anticipated. The evacuation efforts that had seemed inadequate during their planning were actually proving sufficient to disrupt the systematic elimination campaign that Markovich had organized. However, this success was now threatening to derail the negotiation and potentially result in both her death and Richardson's. The evacuation activities you're observing are the result of preparations that began weeks ago, Sarah explained truthfully. Local civilians have been organizing their own protection networks because they couldn't rely on international forces to respond quickly enough to threats. What you're seeing isn't a coordinated military response, it's community self-defense. This explanation appeared to resonate with Markovich's understanding of irregular warfare dynamics. He had probably encountered similar civilian resistance networks in previous conflicts and understood how effective they could become when properly motivated and organized. However, the tactical challenge they presented to his current operation was becoming a serious problem that required immediate attention. The radio reports continued to describe mounting casualties among paramilitary forces and the failure to secure several key objectives that were central to the overall campaign. Sarah could see Markovich weighing the costs of continuing the operation against the benefits of achieving a negotiated settlement that might salvage some of his strategic goals. I'm proposing a modification to our agreement, Sarah said, sensing an opportunity created by the changing tactical situation. Instead of holding both Richardson and me as hostages, you release him immediately to serve as a liaison with the peacekeeping forces. I remain here as a guarantee of their cooperation with the territorial arrangements we've discussed. This gives you a direct communication channel while maintaining insurance against betrayal. Markovich considered this proposal while consulting with his advisors and receiving updated reports from the field. The operational picture was clearly deteriorating from his perspective, with resistance proving more effective and coordinated than his intelligence had suggested. The opportunity to establish direct communication with peacekeeping leadership was becoming more valuable as his military options became more limited. After nearly an hour of discussion and consultation, Markovich agreed to Sarah's modified proposal. Richardson would be released immediately to return to the peacekeeping base with specific terms for a ceasefire arrangement that would allow both sides to consolidate their positions and negotiate a longer-term settlement. Sarah would remain at the monastery as a guarantor of peacekeeping compliance with the agreement. The reunion with Richardson took place in the monastery's chapel, where Sarah found her commander bruised and exhausted but otherwise unharmed. His relief at seeing her was immediately tempered by concern about the risk she had taken to reach the monastery and the danger she was accepting by remaining behind. "Sarah, this is insane," Richardson said quietly as they were given a few minutes to discuss the arrangement privately. "You've put yourself in an impossible position. If anything goes wrong with this ceasefire, Markovich will blame you personally." Sarah explained her assessment of the tactical situation and her belief that the proposed arrangement offered the best chance of preventing a larger catastrophe. The civilian evacuation networks were buying time, but they couldn't sustain indefinite resistance against organized military forces. A negotiated pause would allow for more systematic evacuation while preventing the international escalation that would likely result in far greater casualties. The key is making sure the peacekeeping response supports the civilian networks rather than replacing them, Sarah emphasized. Miriam's people know the territory and the population. They can coordinate evacuations more effectively than any external force, but they need time and resources to complete the work safely. Richardson absorbed her analysis while reviewing the ceasefire terms that Markovich had outlined. The agreement was complex and would require careful coordination between multiple parties, but it offered a realistic framework for de-escalating the immediate crisis while addressing some of the underlying grievances that had motivated the violence. As Richardson prepared to return to the peacekeeping base to present the proposed agreement, Sarah faced the reality of remaining in enemy territory with no guarantee of her eventual release. The success of the arrangement depended entirely on both sides honoring commitments that were based on tactical calculations rather than mutual trust. The final conversation between Sarah and Richardson took place as dawn was breaking over the hills surrounding the monastery. Both of them understood that they might never see each other again, but both were convinced that the risk was justified by the potential to save hundreds of innocent lives. "Make sure Miriam's network gets the support they need," Sarah said as Richardson prepared to leave. "They're the key to making this work. The peacekeeping forces need to coordinate with them rather than trying to replace their operations." Richardson nodded, knowing that Sarah's sacrifice would be meaningless if the ceasefire agreement failed to prevent the humanitarian catastrophe that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier. As he departed the monastery under escort, Sarah watched from a window, knowing that the success or failure of everything they had worked for would be determined in the days ahead. The radio traffic from the city gradually changed throughout the morning as news of the ceasefire agreement reached field commanders on both sides. Sarah listened to reports of families emerging from hiding places, medical supplies reaching wounded civilians, and evacuation convoys moving safely through areas that had been under attack just hours before. 3 days later, as Sarah sat in the monastery courtyard reading reports of successful evacuations and declining violence, she received word that the broader ceasefire was holding and that negotiations for her release had been successful. Markovich approached her personally to announce that she would be free to return to the peacekeeping base the following morning. "Your intelligence was accurate," he said simply, "and your people honored the agreement. Perhaps there are other solutions to these problems besides killing." Sarah's return to the peacekeeping base was met with relief from Richardson and recognition from UN headquarters that her unauthorized mission had prevented what intelligence assessments later confirmed would have been a massive humanitarian catastrophe. The networks that Miriam had organized continued to operate long after the immediate crisis passed, eventually helping thousands of families reach safety as the broader conflict continued to evolve. The monastery where Sarah had been held was eventually abandoned by paramilitary forces as political changes in the region made their operations untenable. Years later, when Sarah returned to the area as part of a post-conflict reconstruction mission, she found Elena still living in the nearby village, having survived the war and chosen to remain in the place where she had once risked everything to help strangers find safety in a time of unimaginable danger.